The Nordic Model, coming to an end, a social model formed after World War II, is facing comprehensive economic, social, and political challenges. This of course does not mean that the Nordic countries will end up in economic recession, social unrest, and political crisis, but it may make people pay more attention to the objective conditions that the best example is. This reputation relies on to exist in the international community. Each country needs to choose the path to modernization according to its own actual situation. The experiences of other countries can be referenced, but never become the golden rule. Northern Europe includes 5 countries: Denmark on the Jutland Peninsula, Norway and Sweden on the Scandinavian Peninsula, Finland and Iceland, as well as the Danish territories of the Faroe Islands and Greenland, and the Finnish archipelago of Åland. Land and the Svalbard archipelago of Norway. After World War II, Northern Europe gradually became a mythical existence, developed economy, excellent welfare, stable politics, peaceful society, naturally becoming an excellent example in the world. Growing worldwide. The Nordic model has become an attractive development model globally. Outstanding economic position and rich natural resources. In fact, the development and prosperity of Northern Europe is largely due to its own natural conditions. First, the economic position of the Nordic countries is very favorable. Because it is located on peninsulas and islands in northwestern Europe, Northern Europe can not only enjoy the spillover and radiation effects of the 5 Western European economies but also avoid to a certain extent the conflicts continue to arise between great powers. Second, the 5 Nordic countries are all small countries with large territories and sparse populations. Sweden, the most populous country, has only 10.3 million people and a population density of 24.6 people/km2. Denmark, which has the highest population density, is 136.5 people/km2 but has a population of only 5.84 million people. Finland has a population of 5.539 million people, Norway has a population of 5.534 million people, and Iceland, the least populous country, has only 370,000 people, with a population density of 3.4 people/km2. Third, the 5 Nordic countries have temperate climates. Although they are all at high latitudes, due to the influence of the hot North Atlantic Ocean current, Northern Europe has warm and humid areas, suitable for humans to live. Fourth, the 5 Nordic countries have extremely rich natural resources, rich in fisheries, forestry, and minerals. Norway and Denmark are also major oil developers in the North Sea. Norway is the world's 3rd largest crude oil exporter and Europe's largest natural gas producer. Obviously, talking about the success of the Nordic model cannot help but mention these conditions that belong to the factors that create myths. Furthermore, Northern Europe has actually undergone profound changes since the end of the Cold War. The Ukraine crisis has accelerated this change, and Norse mythology is about to come to an end. Abandon the policy of neutrality without alliances. The important premise for forming Nordic mythology is that after World War II, Europe continued to maintain peace and stability. The 5 Nordic countries are located in the northwest corner of Europe. From modern times until now, they have always tried to stay away from disputes between great powers. Although such a national policy could not help them completely stay out of the 2 world wars, the damage they suffered was much less than other European countries. After World War II ended, Denmark, Norway and Iceland became founding members of NATO. While Sweden and Finland, countries close to the Soviet Union, pursued a policy of military non-alignment and maintained a neutral position so as not to become outposts of the US-Soviet confrontation. After the Ukraine crisis escalated in 2022, Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO. Although facing some obstacles due to opposition from Turkey and Hungary, Finland officially joined NATO on April 4, 2023, and Sweden's accession process is also accelerating to completion with ratification by Turkey in January and Hungary in February this year. Finland and Sweden chose to join NATO during the Ukraine crisis not because they were afraid of Russia, but because they were no longer afraid of Russia. At the same time, taking advantage of the Ukraine crisis to change the remaining neutral policy in history, completely integrating into the Western camp led by the US. Historically, Sweden and Finland remaining neutral were both reluctant and even shameful choices. Sweden was once a Baltic Sea power, weakened by its complete defeat in the Northern War from 1700 to 1721 with Tsarist Russia and shifting to pursue a neutral policy of non-alignment. During the two world wars, Sweden always walked a tightrope between being pro-German and pro-British and French, not only protecting the country from the devastation of war but also making a lot of money from the war. It can be said that Sweden has benefited greatly in its policy of neutrality. On the contrary, behind Finland's neutrality is a piece of history that would like to be forgotten. From November 1939 to March 1940, Finland participated in the disastrous Winter War with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union captured the Karelia region, including Vyborg, Finland's second largest city. In June 1941, Finland coordinated with Nazi Germany to retake occupied territories, but always did not recognize the alliance with Germany. This neutrality policy leaves relatively large salvage space for Finland. In February 1944, Finland decided to revolt, reversing its policy when it saw the Soviet Union's victory. Thanks to that, they did not join Germany in becoming a defeated country. During the war and after the war, the Finnish government established a neutral path for the country's diplomacy. Obviously, Sweden and Finland both have historical resentments with Russia. After the war, they did not join NATO immediately because they did not want to become a front-line battlefield in the confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union. After the end of the Cold War, Sweden and Finland joined the European Union in 1995, increasing cooperation with NATO. In fact, they abandoned their non-alignment policy long ago. However, in the context of NATO's continuous expansion to the east, the two countries still choose to stay outside NATO. After the Ukraine crisis escalated, Sweden and Finland actively participated in NATO operations to provide military support to Ukraine. In particular, Finland has a 1,200 kilometers border with Russia and actively deploys aid to Ukraine. By February 2024, Finland's military aid to Ukraine had reached 22 installments, donating billions of dollars worth of military equipment, including F-16 fighter jets. On December 13, 2023, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Oslo, Norway, to attend the second Ukraine-Nordic summit, in which 5 Nordic countries pledged aid and military equipment. Billions of dollars for Ukraine. This move was made in the context of the U.S. House of Representatives withholding military aid to Ukraine. The Nordic countries dare to show such a hawkish attitude towards Russia, not because they believe that NATO will guarantee their security but because they believe that Russia is not capable or even willing to go to war with them. Indeed, Russia's response to Finland joining NATO only emphasized that this action would have a negative impact on Russian-Finnish relations. The main response measure was simply to establish the Leningrad military district. There is no evidence that Sweden and Finland's abandonment of neutrality was the result of external pressure. For them, remaining neutral in the collective actions of the West is an independent foreign policy. This may pose a higher risk than actively pressuring Russia, a debt that Finland and Sweden need to consider. In terms of Norse mythology, the Nordic countries' strong aid to Ukraine has changed their image of post-World War II peacekeeping, and the erosion cannot be underestimated. This soft power. The welfare state crisis is profound. The Nordic countries are the most typical Western welfare states. What they have in common is that the state provides people with comprehensive welfare care from birth to death through high taxes. It includes maternity benefits, child care, education, employment, work accident benefits, unemployment benefits, elder care, housing, medical care, funerals, etc. The Nordic model of the welfare state is characterized by comprehensive coverage, large proportions of social services, and relatively small individual burdens. Therefore, Northern Europe was once considered the region with the highest happiness index in the world. The Gini index measuring the gap between rich and poor ranges from 0.2 to 0.26, the lowest level in the world. However, even for developed economies like the Nordic countries, which are small countries with small populations and abundant internal resources, maintaining this high-tax high-welfare model is not a good idea. Easy thing. After the end of the Cold War, Northern European countries also carried out neoliberal reform one after another, following measures such as the UK and the US in promoting the privatization of state-owned enterprises and controlling growth. Public welfare, marketization of social welfare. After decades of reform, the basic structure of the Nordic welfare state has not changed, but the social model still bears some colors of the Anglo-American model. On the surface, the pressure for reform in the Nordic countries comes mainly from financial difficulties. As the region with the highest rate of public spending in Europe, after decades of cuts, the current public spending of the 5 Nordic countries accounts for about 50% of gross domestic product, GDP, higher than average. Of the EU, 46.3%. Among them, Norway has the highest rate of 63%. With more than 80% of government spending on social benefits, many people believe that high taxes due to high benefits limit the motivation of Nordic workers and their ability to compete. International painting. This is certainly not wrong, but in reality it is the export-oriented economic structure of the Nordic countries that is the root cause of challenging the financial sustainability of the welfare state. Outside, people often jokingly say, the world economy has a cold, the Northern European economy has a fever. In 2009, the GDP of Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Iceland decreased by 5.2%, 4.9%, 8.3%, 1.7% and 6.8%, respectively. Iceland became the first country to fall into a public debt crisis. In this case, rigid welfare spending standards inevitably exacerbate financial difficulties. After the comprehensive escalation of the Ukraine crisis, the Nordic model faces another wave of serious challenges. The 5 Nordic countries are all facing difficulties due to low growth and high inflation. According to EU statistics, Sweden's GDP grew by 2.9% year-on-year in 2022, Finland by 1.6% and Denmark by 2.7%. All are below the EU average of 3.4%. Norway and Iceland, which did not join the EU, are in a slightly better situation, but also have structural problems. Therefore, it can be seen that the model of a small country with a small population that Norse mythology is based on certainly depends a lot on external factors. External fluctuations will certainly require increased flexibility in the high welfare regime. Social welfare states in Northern Europe are also facing racial diversity challenges. Essentially, the high welfare of the Nordic countries is a government-run system in which people take care of each other based on shared racial and religious beliefs. After the 1980s, the number of immigrants in the Nordic countries continuously increased. According to statistics, by 2020, the number of immigrants in Sweden has accounted for 19.8% of the total population, Iceland is 15.2%, Norway is 14%, Denmark is 11%, Finland is 6.4%. Disharmony between foreign immigrants and native Nordic people exists widely, causing significant erosion of the nation's social welfare foundation. Sweden's migration minister Maria Malmer Stenergard said that the increase in the number of immigrants in recent years, combined with poor social harmony, has led to Sweden's social segregation becoming even more prominent. Currently, radical anti-immigrant ideology is increasing in Northern European countries. Many people believe that immigration threatens their country's traditional culture, values, and social order. And this, for the Nordic welfare state regime that takes a harmonious and fair society as its goal, is no different from adding fuel to the fire. The political consensus shifted to the far right. After World War II, the Nordic countries generally established a consensus political structure ruled by center-left social democratic parties. Respect equality, social solidarity, and build welfare state values. It has long implemented Keynesian policies of high employment, high taxes, high spending. After the end of the Cold War, the ideology of social democracy was completely outclassed by Anglo-American neoliberalism, and the influence of center-right parties in Northern Europe increased markedly. In recent years, far-right forces in Northern Europe have emerged, and most countries have far-right participation in the ruling coalition. Ideologically, the Nordic countries in the post-Cold War period have all undergone a transition from social democracy to liberal democracy, then to democracy. Nation. All 5 Nordic countries have proportional representation electoral systems. This makes it difficult for one party to hold a majority of seats in the National Assembly. Ruling parties often have to form coalition governments with other parties to come to power. If this multi-party cooperation regime wants to maintain political stability, it must form a common political awareness. Its advantage is that it helps ensure that different interest groups and social classes have the opportunity to participate in politics, forming a relatively stable and moderate political atmosphere. But the disadvantage is that it easily creates opportunities for progressive political parties to participate in politics. Far-right political policies can be increasingly transformed into government policies. In October 2022, Kristersson of the moderate Swedish far-right party came to power. He was elected Prime Minister of Sweden with the lowest number of votes since 1978, 176 in favor and 173 against. To maintain his position of power, Kristersson chose to form a coalition government with the far-right Sweden Democrats. Although the far-right failed to gain a seat in the government, the coalition government had to compromise with the party on immigration, sharply reducing the annual refugee quota from 6,400 to 900, while also plans to deport immigrants who commit misbehavior. When the political consensus shifts to the far right, even if the center-left party is in power, the political views of the center-right and even the far right can still exert influence. Not small at all. Since June 2019, Fredriksson of the center-left Social Democratic Party has served as Prime Minister of Denmark. In the 2022 parliamentary election, her Social Democratic Party won 90 seats, while the far-right coalition won 73 seats. In the end, the Social Democrats, Liberals, and Moderates formed a new coalition government. In this election, the far-right Danish People's Party received only 2.6% of the vote, but the party's anti-immigration ideology still has a great influence on the Danish government. The political consensus of the Nordic countries has eroded the Nordic political mythology of humanity, equality, and harmony built after World War II. First, criticizing globalization is no longer a political taboo. Danish Prime Minister Fredriksson emphasized during the 2019 election campaign that it is increasingly clear to me that the costs of unchecked globalization, mass immigration, and labor mobility free movement is the responsibility of the grassroots class. Therefore, Denmark must implement a strict immigration reception policy. Second, the rise of extremist forces. On September 3, 2023, when an anti-Muslim protester publicly burned the Quran in Malmö, Sweden's third-largest city, it caused tensions between Sweden and Middle Eastern countries, including Turkey. KY. According to French news agency AFP, nearly half of Malmö's population are immigrants or come from immigrant families, where shootings and bombings occur almost every day, causing many locals to worry. Settle. Third, welfare state reform is increasingly radical. Of the 5 Nordic countries, Sweden has the greatest level of welfare reform. Challenges have emerged such as reduced levels of public health services, lack of health workers, and uneven distribution of health resources. To save financial costs, the Swedish government has also taken measures to abolish some police stations and cut the police force, increasing risks to social security. Nordic mythology formed after the Second World War is facing comprehensive economic, social, and political challenges. This of course does not mean that the Nordic countries will end up in economic recession, social unrest, and political crisis. But it can make people pay more attention to the objective conditions that this excellent example relies on to exist in the international community. Each country needs to choose the path to modernization according to its own actual situation. The experiences of other countries can be referenced, but never become the golden rule. Perhaps, currently, abandoning the story Norse mythology will be more beneficial than learning from this model. Translator-author, Diane Dukvan is a researcher, Deputy Director of the Institute Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences.